In May 1945, 1,000 German soldiers did something no one expected. They piled up their Wehrmacht uniforms in a massive heap and set them on fire. These weren't deserters. They weren't cowards. They were prisoners of war in North Carolina. And what they'd just seen in a darkened room changed everything. Here's what makes this moment so powerful. These men had spent the last year living what many of them later called the best time of their lives. They were eating the same meals as American soldiers. They were gaining weight. Some put on 57 pounds. They were watching movies 4 nights a week, earning wages, playing sports. Then they saw footage of liberated concentration camps. And in that moment, 1,000 men decided their uniforms, the symbol of everything they'd fought for, had to burn. In the next 30 minutes, I'm taking you inside one of the most extraordinary psychological transformations of World War II. You'll discover why German prisoners of war were treated so well in America that it shocked them. You'll see how the U.S. military ran a secret re-education program that technically violated the Geneva Convention. You'll understand the moment when visual evidence of the Holocaust broke through years of propaganda and denial. And you'll witness what happened when moral reality collided with military identity so forcefully that grown men burned the clothes off their backs. If you want to understand how ordinary people confront extraordinary evil and what it takes to change someone's mind when everything they believed turns out to be a lie, tap that like button right now. This story will challenge everything you think you know about guilt, shame, and redemption. Let me set the scene. It's spring 1945, Camp Butner, North Carolina, Granville County, just outside Durham. This is a massive facility, a 5,000-man prisoner of war camp. But here's what's fascinating. This isn't just any POW camp. Camp Butner houses 700 to 900 non-German prisoners who were captured wearing German uniforms. Poles, Czechs, French, Dutch, Belgians, Russians, even Mongolians. Men who'd been forced into Wehrmacht service. Men who already hated the Nazis. And alongside them, about 1,000 German soldiers. Most of them Afrika Korps troops captured in Tunisia back in May 1943. They'd arrived in North Carolina in spring 1944. By the time we reach our story in May 45, they've been in American custody for nearly 2 years. Now here's what you need to understand about their experience. These men are living in conditions that would have seemed like absolute luxury compared to what was happening in Germany at that moment. They're receiving the exact same food rations as American soldiers. We're talking about Thanksgiving dinners, Christmas meals. One former prisoner later reported he gained 26 kilograms. That's 57 pounds over just 2 years of captivity. Think about that. While Germany is starving, while cities are being bombed into rubble, these prisoners of war are gaining weight. They're being paid 80 cents a day for their work. That's roughly equivalent to $15 in today's money. It's basically the same as what American privates earn. They're working on farms, in mills, in canneries. And here's the remarkable part. Many of them returned to Germany after the war with several $100s in savings. In a devastated country where money means survival, that's a fortune. But it gets better. 4 nights a week, they're watching movies. They have access to musical instruments, art supplies, woodworking tools. They have private radios. They have libraries full of books that were banned in Nazi Germany. They're playing sports. They're putting on theatrical performances. They're taking educational courses that will give them credit at German universities when they return home. Arnold Kramer, and remember this name because he's the leading scholar on this topic, spent years interviewing former German POWs. And here's what he found. Over and over again, these men told him the same thing. Their time in American prison camps was, and I'm quoting here, the time of their lives. Now, before you get angry about that, understand why the United States did this. It wasn't kindness, it was strategy. The U.S. government desperately wanted Germany to treat American prisoners well. A poll in November 1943 found that 74% of Americans blamed the German government for the war, not the German people themselves. So the thinking went like this. Treat German prisoners according to the Geneva Convention, hope Germany reciprocates, save American lives. Now the American public? They're furious about all this. The U.S. government is receiving hundreds of letters every single week protesting the good treatment of German POWs. Many Americans are demanding these prisoners be immediately killed. Think about that. Newspapers are printing regular casualty lists. American boys are dying on Pacific Islands, and German prisoners are watching movies and gaining weight in North Carolina. The government has a tough job convincing the public that treating prisoners according to the Geneva Convention makes it more likely Germany will treat American prisoners well in return. It's strategic, not sentimental, but it's a hard sell when grief and anger run so deep. Here's something else most Americans didn't know. Coverage of the camps was intentionally limited until the end of the war. Partly to comply with the Geneva Convention, partly to avoid fear about having hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers on American soil, and partly because of what I'm about to tell you. There's something else happening here, something the American public didn't know about, something that was technically illegal under international law. The U.S. military is running a secret re-education program. It's called the Special Projects Division, established in fall 1943 by the Office of the Provost Marshal General. It's directed by university professors, and its mission is to introduce democratic values to German prisoners and counter Nazi ideology without them realizing it's propaganda. Here's how it works. They publish a prison newspaper called Der Ruf, The Call. It's edited by sympathetic German POWs, so it doesn't feel like American propaganda. They distribute books that were banned in Nazi Germany. They show American films and documentaries. They teach courses on American geography, history, and politics. And here's the key detail. This entire program is kept secret. Why? Because it probably violates the Geneva Convention's ban on exposing prisoners to propaganda. And because if Germany finds out, they might retaliate against American POWs in their custody. Now, most of this re-education program is actually pretty ineffective. The intellectual approach doesn't work. The prisoners find Der Ruf boring. It's essentially a literary journal with almost no current news. Surveys show no significant change in the views of the vast majority of prisoners. Reading materials are too academic. They don't connect. Think about why this fails. You're taking men who've been immersed in Nazi propaganda for over a decade. You're handing them books and newspapers and expecting intellectual arguments to undo years of indoctrination. It doesn't work that way. Human psychology isn't that simple. The professors running the Special Projects Division mean well. They're academics. They believe in the power of ideas, the persuasiveness of logic, the appeal of democracy when properly explained. But they're operating from a fundamentally flawed assumption. They think changing minds is primarily an intellectual process. They're about to learn it's something else entirely. It's emotional. It's visceral. It's about confronting truth so undeniable that your brain can't rationalize it away. But then, May 8th, 1945 happens. VE Day. Victory in Europe Day. Germany surrenders unconditionally to the Allied forces, and everything changes. Drop a comment right now if you're starting to see where this is going. Because what happens next is when the re-education program discovers something that works far better than any book or newspaper ever could. Subscribe to this channel because in the next section, I'm showing you the moment when 1,000 men's understanding of reality collapsed in a single afternoon. The war in Europe is over. Allied forces have been liberating concentration camps for weeks now. Bergen-Belsen on April 15th, Buchenwald on April 11th, Dachau on April 29th, and military cameramen have been filming everything. Now, here's what you need to understand about these German prisoners of war. Most of them are Afrika Korps troops. They fought in North Africa. They were captured in Tunisia in May 1943. The Holocaust, the industrial extermination of 6 million Jews, that happened primarily on the Eastern Front. Geographically and informationally, these men were distant from those atrocities. Arnold Kramer, in all his years of interviewing former German POWs, made a fascinating observation. He never met one who admitted to being a Nazi, and most Germans, he found, had some knowledge that concentration camps existed. But the full extent of the extermination, the systematic murder, the gas chambers, the crematoria? That wasn't widely known, even among German soldiers. Alex Funke was a German POW who served as a chaplain at Camp Algona in Iowa. He was actually considered politically unreliable by the Gestapo because of his participation in the Confessing Church, a Protestant movement that opposed Nazi control of German churches. Even he, someone who was aware of Nazi persecution of Jews, someone who knew concentration camps existed, even he only learned the full extent of the Holocaust from media reports after the camps were liberated. So imagine you're a German prisoner of war in North Carolina. You've spent the last year eating well, watching movies, learning English, playing soccer. The war is over. Germany has surrendered. You're thinking about going home, rebuilding, seeing your family, and then you're ordered to report to a large room. You walk in and see armed military police stationed around the perimeter. That's unusual. That immediately tells you something important is about to happen. The room is tense. Guards are there to maintain order, to prevent violence, to stop chaos if it breaks out. The lights go down, and then you see it. Footage from the liberated concentration camps. The German prisoners later gave these films a nickname. They called them Knochen films, films of bones. Now, let me be specific about what these films showed, because this isn't abstract. This is the footage shot by Allied military cameramen in April and May 1945 as they liberated camp after camp. Bergen-Belsen. British troops found 60,000 prisoners, most of them starving, 13,000 unburied corpses lying in piles, typhus epidemic raging through the survivors. The footage shows British soldiers using bulldozers to push bodies into mass graves because there's no other way to handle the scale of death. Buchenwald. American forces found 21,000 survivors. The film shows the crematorium ovens, the hooks where prisoners were hung, the medical experimentation facilities, the shrunken heads and tattooed skin that guards kept as trophies. Dachau, the first concentration camp, opened in 1933. When Americans arrived on April 29th, they found 39 freight cars filled with decomposing bodies. The SS had attempted to evacuate prisoners, but simply locked them in the cars and left them to die. The footage is unbearable. This is what the prisoners at Camp Butner are watching. This is what they can't look away from. Can you imagine what they saw? Mass graves, piles of corpses stacked like cordwood, emaciated survivors who looked like skeletons with skin stretched over them, gas chambers, crematoria, the industrial machinery of genocide. This is the moment when abstract knowledge becomes visceral reality. Now, here's what's crucial to understand. The reactions weren't uniform. The prisoners didn't all respond the same way. Some hardline Nazis remained loyal. They refused to believe the footage was real. They insisted it was Allied propaganda. Some were skeptical, caught between disbelief and dawning horror. They wanted to look away, but couldn't. But many prisoners, and this is documented across multiple camps, many experienced profound shock. The films shattered their worldview. Everything they'd believed, everything they'd fought for, everything they'd told themselves about serving their country with honor, it all collapsed. The prisoners were amazed. They were disbelieving. They nicknamed the films Knochen films, not just because of the skeletal bodies, but because the images seemed too horrific to be real. They looked like something from a nightmare. But the footage kept rolling, and the evidence kept mounting, and slowly the truth broke through. At some camps, prisoners called for Germany to surrender after viewing the films. Of course, Germany had already surrendered by then, but the psychological need to distance themselves from the Nazi regime was so powerful they felt compelled to say it anyway. At other camps, something even more remarkable happened. Some prisoners volunteered to fight against Japan. They wanted to somehow make amends. The American military seriously considered this idea, but ultimately rejected it. At multiple camps, a total of 119 prisoners formally renounced Nazism after seeing the films. But at Camp Butner? At Camp Butner, 1,000 men did something far more dramatic. Hit that notification bell right now, because what happens next is the climax of this story. And it reveals something profound about human psychology, moral awakening, and the power of undeniable truth. After the film ends at Camp Butner, there's silence. The armed military police are watching carefully. They're ready for anything: violence, denial, chaos. But what happens instead is something nobody anticipated. The prisoners start talking among themselves. And then, without any order from camp authorities, without any direction from American officers, they begin to move. They walk out to an open area in the camp, and they start gathering their Wehrmacht uniforms. 1,000 German prisoners of war piled their uniforms into a massive heap, the gray-green wool fabric that marked them as soldiers of the Third Reich, the uniforms they'd worn with pride, or at least worn with the identity of serving their country, the symbol of everything they'd fought for. And then they set it all on fire. Think about what this means. These men aren't burning their uniforms because they're ordered to. This isn't some official denazification ceremony imposed by the Americans. This is voluntary. This is spontaneous. This is 1,000 individual men making the same choice in the same moment because they've all experienced the same moral earthquake. They're burning their past. They're burning their military identity. They're burning their association with a regime that committed crimes so monstrous they can barely comprehend what they've just seen. The smoke rises into the North Carolina sky. Gray-green wool turning to ash, brass buttons melting, insignia curling and blackening, and with it, something else is burning. The story they'd told themselves, the comfortable narrative, the idea that they were just soldiers doing their duty for their country. Because here's what that film footage took away from them. It took away the ability to separate their military service from the regime's crimes. It took away the luxury of saying, "I didn't know." It took away the distance between being a soldier in North Africa and being part of a system that built factories of death. Now, here's where the psychology gets really complex, because this isn't just about rejecting Nazism. Most of these men probably weren't fanatical Nazis to begin with. They were conscripts, soldiers, men who'd been swept up in events larger than themselves. What they're confronting is something deeper. It's the question of complicity. It's cognitive dissonance. It's the gap between who they thought they were, honorable soldiers serving their country, and the reality of what their country did while they were serving it. Were ordinary soldiers responsible for the regime's crimes? That's the question burning in their minds along with those uniforms. They fought in North Africa, not in Poland. They captured Allied soldiers in desert warfare. They didn't round up Jews in ghettos. But they wore the same uniform as the men who did. They served the same government. They fought for the same cause. Burning the uniforms is a way of saying, I reject this. I am not this. This is not who I want to be. But here's what makes this moment so historically significant. Not all the prisoners responded this way. At Camp Butner, remember, there were about 1,000 German soldiers. All of them saw the films, but not all of them burned their uniforms. Some remained in denial. Some clung to the idea that the footage was propaganda. Some were too proud, too stubborn, too invested in their military identity to make such a dramatic gesture. And we need to acknowledge this complexity, because it would be easy to make this story simple. 1,000 good Germans who saw the truth and changed, thousands of bad Germans who refused to see. But human psychology doesn't work that way. Some of the men who didn't burn their uniforms weren't necessarily Nazis. Maybe they were in shock. Maybe they needed more time to process. Maybe their minds were protecting them from truth too painful to accept all at once. Denial is a defense mechanism. It's how humans survive psychological trauma. And some of the men who did burn their uniforms? We can't assume they were all experiencing perfect moral clarity. Some might have been following the crowd. Some might have been making a political calculation about what would help them when they returned to Germany. Some might have been genuine in their horror, but would later backslide into old ways of thinking. Human motivation is messy. Moral awakening isn't a clean, straight line. The fact that 1,000 chose to burn their uniforms tells us something important. It tells us that moral awakening isn't automatic. It requires a perfect storm of factors. Factor 1, they were physically safe. They weren't being threatened or coerced. The Geneva Convention protected them. They'd been treated well. This created psychological space for genuine reflection. Factor 2, the war was over. Germany had surrendered. There was no military loyalty pressure anymore, no fear that their action would be seen as betrayal while their country was still fighting. Factor 3, the evidence was visual. You can argue with written reports. You can dismiss second-hand testimony. But film footage of piles of corpses? That's undeniable in a way that words never are. Factor 4, it was a collective experience. They watched the films together. They processed the horror together. This created a shared emotional moment that enabled group action. One man burning his uniform alone would be an isolated protest. 1,000 men doing it together becomes a movement. And Factor 5, timing. This happened after they'd spent a year in American captivity, learning English, interacting with Americans who didn't hate them, seeing a different way of life. The seed had been planted. The film was the water that made it grow. At Fort Bragg, another major POW camp in North Carolina, the Army was running a different kind of re-education. Beginning in July 1945, education officers were teaching 36 courses weekly: agricultural science, industrialism, geography. By late 45, Fort Bragg officers claimed, with what historians now describe as pride and exaggeration, that 95% of POW students were familiar with American life and democracy. At Camp McCall in September 45, prisoners formed 4 political parties and elected a camp spokesman and company leader. They were practicing democracy, testing it out like a new language they were learning to speak. But none of those programs created a moment as visually dramatic, as emotionally powerful, as psychologically significant as 1,000 men burning their uniforms. I've linked some incredible historical resources in the description below if you want to dive deeper into this story. Take a minute to check those out. Now, here's the question that haunts this story. What happened to those 1,000 men when they went home? Most German POWs left the United States between late 1945 and 1946. They returned to a Germany that was utterly destroyed, cities in ruins, economy collapsed, millions dead. The country divided into occupation zones that would eventually become East and West Germany. And here's what we know from the broader research on German POWs. Most of them returned to America's image with positive feelings. They were familiar with English. They had savings. They'd been treated well. In fact, about 5,000 Germans eventually emigrated back to the United States permanently. Think about that number for a moment. 5,000 men who'd been enemy soldiers chose to return to the country that imprisoned them. That tells you everything about the contrast they experienced. They'd seen two different worlds. Totalitarian Germany, where questioning authority could get you killed, democratic America, where even prisoners had rights, and thousands chose America. We don't have detailed follow-up specifically on the 1,000 from Camp Butner who burned their uniforms. That's one of the frustrations of this story. We have the dramatic moment beautifully documented, but then these men disappear back into the chaos of post-war Germany, and we lose track of their individual stories. But we can infer some things from the broader pattern. These men returned to a Germany that was undergoing massive denazification. The Allied occupiers were forcing Germans to confront what had been done in their name. Germans were being marched through concentration camps to see the evidence firsthand. The Nuremberg trials were prosecuting Nazi leaders for crimes against humanity. In that context, the men who'd already experienced their moral reckoning in North Carolina, who'd already burned their uniforms, already rejected the regime, they were probably better prepared than most to rebuild their lives in a new Germany. Arnold Kramer's research shows us something important. In years of interviewing former German POWs, he consistently found that most Germans had convinced themselves they weren't really Nazis. They were just soldiers, just following orders, just doing their duty. But the men who burned their uniforms at Camp Butner? They couldn't hide behind that excuse. They'd made a public declaration. They'd taken a stand. They'd said clearly and dramatically, "We reject this." That's a different psychological position to rebuild from. Think about the courage that took. Not the physical courage of combat, they'd already proven that, but the moral courage to admit complicity, to acknowledge that wearing that uniform, serving that regime, fighting that war, it connected them to unspeakable evil even if they personally didn't commit atrocities. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. Because in a world where we're all asking how ordinary people become complicit in terrible things, this story shows us the moment when some ordinary people chose to stop. Here's what I want you to take away from this. The uniform burning at Camp Butner wasn't about politics. It wasn't about ideology. It was about identity. Those men were saying, "I am not what this uniform represents. I refuse to carry that identity forward." And here's the deeper lesson. Changing someone's mind about deeply held beliefs requires more than arguments. It requires more than facts presented on a page. It requires an undeniable confrontation with reality that's so visceral, so emotionally powerful, that denial becomes impossible. The Special Projects Division tried to re-educate prisoners with newspapers and books. It largely failed. But showing them film footage of liberated concentration camps? That worked. Not on everyone, but on enough people to make 1,000 men burn their uniforms in a single afternoon. You started this video hearing about German soldiers setting fire to their uniforms. Now you understand it was something far more profound. It was a moment of moral reckoning. It was the instant when propaganda lost to reality. It was 1,000 men simultaneously deciding that shame was better than denial. History is full of moments when people make excuses, when they rationalize, when they say they didn't know, couldn't have known, weren't responsible. The men at Camp Butner could have done that. Many of their fellow prisoners did, but 1,000 chose differently. They chose to know. They chose to be responsible. They chose to carry the shame of what had been done under their flag, and then they chose to burn that flag and start over. That's not comfortable history. That's not feel-good history. But it's true history, and it matters, because we live in a world where we're all wearing uniforms of one kind or another. National uniforms, political uniforms, ideological uniforms, cultural uniforms. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, we need to ask ourselves the hard question: does this uniform still represent what I believe? Or has something happened that makes it impossible to keep wearing? For 1,000 German prisoners of war in North Carolina in May 1945, the answer was clear. The flames that consumed those Wehrmacht uniforms didn't erase what had happened. They didn't absolve guilt. They didn't undo the Holocaust. But they marked a moment of transformation, a before and after, a line in the sand. On one side, the soldiers they'd been. On the other side, the men they'd have to become. You now know one of the most psychologically complex and morally challenging stories from World War II. You understand why German POWs were treated so well in America. You've seen how a secret re-education program worked. You've witnessed the moment when visual evidence shattered denial. And you've learned what it looks like when 1,000 people confront terrible truth and choose transformation over comfort. Here's what I want you to do with this knowledge. First, ask yourself the uncomfortable question: what beliefs am I carrying that might not survive confrontation with undeniable evidence? We all have them. Convictions we hold not because we've examined them carefully, but because they're comfortable, familiar, tribal. Second, practice intellectual humility. The German POWs who burned their uniforms had to admit they'd been wrong about something fundamental. That's hard. Our egos resist it. But it's the only path to growth. Third, remember that changing minds requires more than arguments. If you want to reach someone who disagrees with you, facts alone won't cut it. You need emotional connection. You need undeniable evidence presented in a way that bypasses defensive rationalization. The Holocaust films worked when newspapers failed because images are visceral in ways words aren't. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because I'm not done with stories about moral complexity in World War II. In my next video, I'm revealing what happened when Allied soldiers liberated concentration camps and had to decide how to treat the guards they found there. Some of those guards were executed on the spot, some were put on trial, and some were let go. The decisions made in those first hours tell us something profound about justice, revenge, and humanity under impossible circumstances. Click subscribe. You won't want to miss it. I'll see you in the next one.